So we've now got around about 20-25 minutes just to go through a panel session. So this is your opportunity to either log on to Slido if you want to put those questions in, and we'll be having a look at Slido. We'll also take raising of hands. But what we'll do to sort of kick off, we'll just ask the facilitators to give some remarks in terms of some of their thoughts that were coming back from the audience, in terms of some of the challenges that were being presented, but also some of the things that they can share. So some of that knowledge that other people were sharing around productivity in those discussions. So if I just take it in turn, to start off with Neil, if you'd like just to give your account of the conversation that you had.
I think the focus was obviously fairly and squarely around the productivity agenda. I think one of the key elements that was added to the conversation was about understanding where the value is added through that process. And although we talk about some quite high-level productivity measures that we were using to get the process started and for us to really get and support the sharing of data and collaboration across the industry of the learnings that we need to take forward, ultimately what drives productivity at the site level is how efficient and effective the operative at site level can be. And everything else needs to be focused at enabling those last actions and activities on site to be as effective and efficient, as safe, productive and quality output led as possible. And everything else needs to be focused to do that. And I think what I was sort of saying in that conversation was that the approach that we've tried to demonstrate through the demonstration project at the Forge is that taking learnings from the manufacturing sector and trying to apply them in construction is one way of doing that. There are other things we can do, but I think it is a key step change that we can take by actually industrialising our approach to construction, doing more off-site, less on-site, automating the process. That also helps in terms of providing a safer working environment and a more productive working environment. But ultimately, it's what the people achieve at the site level. Putting those elements together is ultimately that delivers the productive outputs that we're looking for.
And Neil, are we making as much progress as we should do around off-site manufacture?
I think that lots of progress has been made, but we're still at a level where there's a massive amount of opportunity to do much more. And I think what perhaps isn't recognised so much, we've developed solutions and designs, and the thinking around the moving to off-site and manufacturing of components on site happens quite late in the process. Our design is split into two parts: the design that we do at the beginning with design teams and consultants, and the design that's done later by the supply chain to convert those ideas and that outline conceptual design into something you can physically build. And the gap in between is lost opportunity for us to improve the productivity. And somehow we have to find ways of being able to bring those two stages of design closer together so they can work alongside each other, so that when we go out to procure and deliver projects, we actually know exactly what we're procuring and how it will be built, who will be building it, and how we can make those outputs as productive as possible. So that's a big step change, though. It's a massive disruptional thing for the industry to get its mind around. But it's the only way we'll achieve the sort of growth in productivity that other industries have achieved over the last few decades, whereas construction has largely sort of flatlined over the last 20 years in terms of its improvement in productivity by comparison to the rest of industry, and particularly the manufacturing sector. So there's a massive amount to do. We've done some good stuff, but we don't get the main benefit because we don't involve it right at the beginning when we're thinking about how a building's been designed and is going to be built, and ensuring that how it's going to be manufactured, pre-assembled, and then assembled on site needs to be part of that thinking right at the beginning of the project to get the best output.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Neil. So making some progress, but plenty more to do by the sounds of it. Katie, you posed some questions, so I'm not sure if you had a chance to reflect on those questions, whether people engaged you, but what were your findings?
Well, I think the good news is that definitely from the enthusiasm in the conversation, you know, productivity is definitely something everybody wants to be focusing on and looking at. It's quite interesting. I think universally we agreed as a group We all saw productivity improvements during COVID and seeing it dropping back again now. So, looking at how we can capture some of that best practice that we saw during COVID. We're definitely hitting the mark. We've got the challenge of skill shortage, so while we need to hit productivity, BIM and digital and collaboration are helping. There's a lot more that we can do. Quite a lot of talk about plant automation and robotics. We're seeing as real opportunities, and when we're starting to see that creeping into our projects, but it's not universally adopted. There is a level of cynicism as well with that. Is a machine going to come in and take my job? One of the challenges, actually, when we talked about measuring productivity, quite often, if you think of the old time and motion studies, everybody's worried that you're going to want money from me. Are you going to penalise me because you're doing this? What's in it for me to have my productivity measured? So, dealing with some of those behavioural components is going to be a really important part of this. We can't just look at it on a mechanistic basis. But we did see some really good stuff about AI insight, good examples of how non-productive time is measured using technology, using the sort of tags that people can wear around a project. We saw some really good examples of actually just how camera footage can be collected to extract data from. Because one of the challenges is actually how do we measure this? And Brian, I know we spoke about it at Norton Folgate. It was literally people having to stand there with a piece of paper, wasn't it, and measure time, and how we can get that slicker and use technology to do that. But then it's also thinking about what do we want to measure, because there's so many things that we can measure on site, and all of us saying, and everyone's got slightly different things they want to measure on a project. So it's about setting yourself up for that level of success at the outset. We then went on to talk about skills, and actually having the skills to collect data, analyse data, but also feed it back, because we need a baseline at the beginning of a project. So actually our planners and our estimators need to be able to communicate the level of productivity that we've got built into projects at the start, so we've got something to compare back against. Interesting talking about competitive advantage and productivity as well. If people see it as a competitive advantage, they don't want to share. So one of the challenges is how can we get us to collaborate at an industry level. I had quite a good conversation about actually if we can anchor it to safety. That's something we have no problem collaborating about in terms of data and information and safety. So if we can look at the relationship between safety and productivity, then that might be a good way for us to coalesce around it. So the conversation went in a lot of directions, but some really good feedback there.
Yeah, that was great, and thank you very much for the feedback. And I can see some questions coming in through Slido, so please fill the system up and we'll get to those in a second. Thank you, Katie. So just on to Brian, what were your insights?
Yeah, so I did get caught on one table in the middle here a little bit, and interestingly, when I arrived, I felt there were more questions for me than there were opportunities for me to actually ask questions. One of those early questions was around, well, what did we achieve by collecting this data on Blossom Street and on that particular building, and did we learn anything from it? I think, being honest about it, I think we have to realise, for us to really understand how we can improve productivity, we can't just take one sample. This particular job was a bespoke job in a certain set of circumstances, with a certain architectural finish, with a certain set of logistics. For us to really learn whether we can improve, we're going to have to get committed to measuring our performance on a number of samples. And it's only really when we've done a few different things we'll start to really understand and be able to appreciate the kind of differences that we can make to improve productivity. I mean, Neil and I were talking last Friday just briefly, and I think if we focus, particularly in the supply chain, about what the clients want, they are looking for us to improve. They feel that this productivity is very flat. And so we're going to have to apply our thinking to what we can do to do better. So one job is not enough. We need to be measuring more, and we need to understand more what we can do. I did get a chance to actually to check on whether people are actually collecting data themselves. And I think generally we'd have to say with the group of people I was with, there was a consensus that we're not really going into the level of detailed data collection that perhaps is required to really understand productivity. I asked the group if they had any understanding about the metrics that we've been guided by the CLC to be the metrics that we should be kind of using to determine whether we're achieving productivity. And it was interesting that at least a couple of the people there had not even heard that the CLC had set these metrics. And that there are some aspects in metrics which lead back into Neil's conversation. The CLC have promoted PMV, pre-manufactured value, as a critical part about how we might be able to improve productivity on the jobs as a whole. But we need to be aware of it. We need to be looking at this at a very early stage in design to see how much of these buildings can actually be taken off-site and create a level of reduction of site operatives, which is an issue anyway around Katie's skill shortages and kind of and how we can become more efficient. An interesting one on the question of barriers and challenges that people might feel about disclosing data. I think there was an acknowledgement around the table that there is concern about disclosing kind of too much information to clients. There's almost like a lack of trust as to what they will do with it. And if you think about supply chain generally, they might be wary that if they provide all of this information up through to their client, tier one and developer, will that have an impact on their ability to maintain their margins? So there is a little bit of concern in that area that, and I think how we can create a level of trust between us all on that is a very important question that we need to answer, really. So that was rough.
Thank you, Brian. That was useful. I'm pleased people quizzed you as well. So a huge amount of knowledge to share, but some really useful points raised there. So just on to John. I heard you having some very interesting conversations in the corner there, but what were your main points?
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I think we talked a lot, which is similar to a session we were at 6 or 7 months ago, about the need for a culture change to allow dynamic ideas like this to actually creep in, especially to sites. Sometimes in the back office it's a little bit easier, but when we're looking at construction sites, it's not as simple as just having a clever app available. There has to be a drive, there has to be a culture that allows someone to put their hand up and stop something and correct something when it's going in the wrong direction. And we talked about the fact that maybe what the apps do enable, because you can do something quick and simple, is to sort of, instead of it being a monster where you've got to change an overall system and how the whole process works, you can address little point areas and just, even if it's a temporary plaster that you're putting on until a major change comes through, that actually this will enable small improvements. It isn't going to suddenly increase productivity across a whole site. It's not going to solve the problem, but it will address issues that always add up and accumulate and cause delays. So that was interesting. It stops it being a monster and allows you to address a little problem as a little problem and just make it better. And also the fact that you don't need so much agreement always to address some of the smaller problems, that a smaller group can actually take a decision, because it's not always preparing an app, for example, that makes a difference. It's taking the decision to prepare it and allow it to actually change slightly a process that's in place. So we thought these facilitated the ability to take quicker decisions, especially when they're hooked into existing data. We showed examples in the show and tell there of apps that could work standalone or sit on top of a commercial system. When you sit them on top of the commercial system, you've got real data now. You're not rekeying something, you're not creating a paper form but on a phone instead of on paper. That's still a duplication of something else that's going around with the inherent inaccuracies. And I think when we talked about the application of it, we came back a lot to safety, that we thought that was an area where people have been enabled in the last 5 and 10 years to put their hand up. It is an area where they will follow a correct process, and that part of the culture change has made more progress perhaps than productivity in its own right. And any apps therefore that build off that have got more of a chance of making a difference. And of course, reducing the delays that a safety incident causes is a productivity increase in itself. Other ideas were around status on sites, tracking materials, tracking people, knowing where things are up to. a site manager or a project manager's app so that he's got a quick oversight and things like that. And I think some of those were good ideas in themselves. And then we started talking about, well, if you start having all these ideas, how do you use them? How do you control them? If we've got citizen developers is a phrase we use for the fact that, as Rory said, people can write their own apps and put them together. How do you actually control what could be an explosion of little things like spreadsheets might have been in the past being all over the place, out of control, and you don't know where the real data is and who's keeping what up to date. So we talked about a process that we called establishing a centre of excellence, where you use your IT organisation to provide guardrails, if you like, on what you can and can't do, and actually understand what apps are in play and what apps are out there, which also help in terms of data loss prevention, that somebody who's got a right to access a main back office app can write an app maybe that connects to it, which potentially could be leaking information out that you'd rather have controlled. So the ability to do it in a structured and coordinated way, so get the first few ideas out there, plant the seed, and then help enable people to put these out there in a structured format and address productivity in small bites.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, John. So I'm just going to open it up to the floor in terms of any particular questions. Some questions coming through on Slido, so we'll introduce that to the panel in a second. But if there's a show of hands, and we'll take some questions. So I'll come to you in a second, sir, and any more, and yourself in a second. But just as we lead into the questions, I suppose just one quick one. Just referring to the sort of Slido, in terms of client bodies, and this is really addressed to the panel, are we doing enough to really create a level playing field to encourage off-site manufacture into the industry? So are we using the buying power to drive real change, drive productivity through modern methods of construction? Your views?
I think it's quite interesting. One of the big driving forces behind the Construction Productivity Task Force is that it's been client-led. And I think if you want to get industry to coalesce, I do think client leadership is really important for this. So it's quite interesting seeing the question there about whether client bodies should test contractors' productivity at bid stage as well as the usual predictable subjects. I think there's a role in encouraging the measurement and analysis of productivity during the project life. I think if that's client-driven, then I think it's, to your point, that point of trust, that we're not going to be using this to beat you up, we're going to use this to make improvements. But I do think drive from clients is really important to move this agenda forward with some pace. I turn to Neil as a client, but...
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I think it's a common thing that you can't really improve something if you don't measure it first, and I think the first stage in this is for clients at least to ask their supply chain and their contractors to measure certain productivity measures across the projects that they're involved in. We're obviously encouraging that information to be shared through the task force and through the data trust, so that we can start to look at what is typical practice now, because how can we test contractors, if you like, as the question was asking, if you haven't got any benchmarks even established to know what to ask the question. So I think it starts with measurement. I think that's what we should be focusing on the next generation of projects, so that we really get to understand what we achieve now. I think that will drive, I think, at the individual project level, a desire for the construction teams and the supply chain to work together to actually look at sort of lower level measures, if you like, that could have incremental improvements on activities and outputs on site. And they don't have to necessarily be purely productivity based, because usually it drives other outcomes. It drives more sustainable outcomes. If you're able to reduce waste, if you're able to improve a process, quite often that means the safety of that process is also improved at the same time. So that I think will start to drive those behaviours that are needed to enable us to move the industry along that path. So yeah, I think the clients do have a big responsibility in this, and I would definitely recommend that any clients in this room, or if you're working with your clients, get them to download the documents from the Be Business website, have a read through the playbook, look at the key drivers of what we've picked out, 10 key drivers that we think drive a successful project, understand them, start thinking about those things when you're developing your brief, when you're working with your designers, and when you engage with your contractors and supply chain to deliver your buildings. And particularly the publication that we have that's just focused on a framework thinking to actually start to measure productivity on site and to sort of share those, if you like, as well, and be encouraged to collaborate around the industry. Or even if you don't collaborate, measuring on your project is a start, you know. Working with your clients, encouraging them to think that way is a benefit. And certainly, you know, I have that role of championing that within my own business now and starting to engage as we put our briefs together to say, let's just ask for things to be measured. That's the first step.
Okay.
But it's a really important step.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Katie.
Could I just add a point there in regard to kind of improving productivity? In the private sector playbook, we've referred to 10 key drivers. One of the key ones is around getting an improved design position, and one of the key drivers is early engagement with supply chain. So getting the opportunity to talk to specialists who understand design and who can bring buildability to the solution that the client is looking to achieve is crucial. There are obviously frame contractors out there, many more than my business, that have expertise, cladding contractors, M&E contractors. These people understand how best to improve productivity, and for the clients to be saying that is a key driver, bring in the supply chain early, help to get the design to focus on buildability. That will help us all to become more efficient and hopefully give you better value, Neil.
Thank you, Brian. So I'd just like to turn to the audience now. We've got a question down here, and I'll come to yourself in a second. So,
Yeah, first of all, thanks panel. I think you covered a very widespread of elements towards productivity, ownership, style, talent, collaboration, culture, technology, methodology to deliver things, skills, barriers, and thank you for that. But I do want to add one element to that. So part of my operation role in Deloitte is I help managing the retention of the team, and to do that I basically done a fair amount of research into human resource management. So a report published by PwC several years ago indicated that I think an employee is more than 80% more productive when they are engaged at work. But I believe the same report, or maybe a different one if I remember it wrong, indicated that only 20%, less than 20% of employees are fully engaged. So part of the work that I've done in the last months is to explore ways to increase that employee engagement. So it would be good to hear about panel's thoughts on this aspect and what we can do to kind of get more people to be engaged into the business. Thank you.
okay, so a quick question on employee engagement. Views from the panel.
I mean, we spoke about behavioural side of productivity, because I think they've got to be engaged in it, because otherwise, if we're not careful, you start measuring productivity and you create disengagement. So we're going to have the complete opposite effect. So one of the things we spoke about in the framework is actually how we set ourselves up for this at the outset of a project. So actually involve all the parties, collectively look at what you're going to be measuring and why you're going to be measuring it. So to create that sense of engagement at the outset of a project is really important. If you just turn up and stand there with your clipboard watching somebody work and writing things down, I can guarantee your productivity is going to go down, and similarly your engagement for sure. So yeah, behavioural is really important.
Okay, setting the right behaviours and culture. Any other views from the panel?
I mean, I'd add to that culturally, if from a client perspective, they set a culture of valuing the people, and some of our clients at development level absolutely set the benchmark of how they expect these projects to be run, and they create the environment with the tier one, who I think does mirror that down into their supply chain. So I think it's all about the environment that you put people to work in, isn't it? And I think it's about us all as business owners to create the environment where our staff can be happy and can feel valued. And you know, they are the people who do the work, aren't they? If we can't get that right and make sure that they are motivated, then you know it's going to make our businesses very unsustainable, isn't it?
I think you've got to share the love as well, though, haven't you? I think, you know, when you're looking at productivity benefits, it's not going to be positive if only one party in the arrangements keeps all the benefit for themselves. So I think if you collectively agree about what you're going to measure and how you're going to be driving productivity and sharing the benefit of that, then that works for the engagement
You
piece
get
as
greater
well.
workforce engagement, yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think if you look at the playbook now, the title of the playbook is Trust and Productivity. So to enable those things to happen, there has to be a degree of trust between all the parties. I think we've got to grow a greater level of collaboration in the way that the industry works together, and that then can cement the trust between, if you like, the key stakeholders in that process, the clients and the contractors and the supply chain. But ultimately, if they're engaged and they feel comfortable in that environment, that it's about focusing for the benefit of the process, of the job, of the output, of the ultimate constructed asset, if you like, that's going to play a full role through its life cycle, then that can then mirror down through to the operatives that ultimately need to deliver and to raise their level of engagement, and to support that through training, but also by setting an example. It has to come from the leadership. If there's a trust from the leadership that the clipboard isn't there to penalise them, to reset the bonus rate so it's harder, or whatever they might be in the mindset. It's about trying to make the job deliver better. It's trying to get a better output as a business. Then that will be recognised on the way right the way up to the client, and the sharing of the benefit of that through some form of collaborative contracting processes that we at this moment in time rarely use, to the benefit of all. And if we can drive productivity and greater efficiency, that's going to help us deliver net zero carbon. It's going to result in less accidents. There's approximately 30 people a year die working in construction sites. We've made great inroads and made construction a lot safer in the last couple of decades. But there's still people that die on building sites, and a whole lot more have serious injuries and life-changing injuries. So we need to do things better. And these are the ways we need to do it. And if people can see this is the intention behind these things, there's a lot more to it than just simple productivity. That is just a focus for us that we can all engage on, all collaborate on. It's not necessarily a competitive area. It's about making it a better industry for everybody to be in. If we can get those messages through, maybe we'll drive that engagement that you're looking for. But that's a lot of work for us to do. But I think, and I've been privileged to be on that task force and working with leaders from all parts of the industry, the tier one contractors, supply chain represented through Brian and key designers, having those conversations and having it in an open forum and resulting in two shared documents that we're trying to get people to adopt, support and engage with to improve going forward, and that's what we're really looking for.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Just a question over here. Do you have a mic? So just bring it over. Are there any more questions? If not, we'll conclude after this question. So, don't see any hands. Okay.
I'm Nick Mead from Banner Rook, but I'm also the MMC champion for Construction Industry Council. So I know the pain we're all going through in embracing the MMC. A lot of talk about cultural shift and cultural change, which I think is probably the key driver. We're also going through the after effects of Grenfell with fire testing and compliance. We know where some of the modern methods are being challenged on that with CLT and things like that. I suppose the question is really, and Neil, you mentioned about how we design twice. How do we address this really? Is it the supply chain? Is it the clients? Should the professional bodies, the institutions like the simply get more involved? We talk about there's lots of playbooks in the industry, but what is sort of the key focus? Is it getting it earlier in the early stage 1 and 2 designs and using professional institutions to drive that change, or is it going to be left to the dependency of the sort of the more intelligent clients like the Landsec of this world to just drive it up? Just an opinion really from me.
Yeah, so there seems to be a big challenge out there in terms of duplication in the process, maybe a change in the business model. So what are the panel's views in terms of removing that waste from the process, the historic processes we have as we move into a better world of being more productive?
Well, I think perhaps I'd take it first, as I think you directed it to me. I mean, we have started to try and do that process on some of our recent projects. We've done it historically from time to time, but probably a much more concerted effort in recent times to try and engage the design that's done by the supply chain at the time that you're developing the more detailed design with your consultant teams at the early stages, probably around taking buildings from stage 3 to 4 and then ultimately having the information at stage 5 to be able to manufacture and deliver things. So we've done that by using pre-construction service agreements. It's sort of a methodology, if you like, but I think one of the things that we as an industry have got to find is contracts that allow that process to happen more easily, to get the engagement of key design input from experienced trade contractors like Brian's, from using the expertise and knowledge around logistics and delivery on site from the tier 1 and tier 2 contractors that deliver projects, that understand how things come together. You know, it's not just one element. The challenge is trying to do that in a balanced way while maintaining the commercial objectives of projects, because there's always seemed to be, you know, if you go too early to commit to people, comes back to this trust, then will the costs inflate as a consequence? I think we need to find a way of dealing with that in a contractual world that enables collaboration to happen, that retains the commerciality that's needed and the competition that's required to drive that, but at the same time finding ways to enable that knowledge to be brought together to give the best possible opportunity for more productive building, more productive construction, safer construction, greener construction, building faster and better as we go forward. So, and doing it with the economy of resources and efficiently, and creating a better industry as a consequence. We've just got to find the keys to unlock those doors. We all know the barriers. That's why we've been talking about it for 30, 40 years. But we need to do it. You know, if we saw nothing else, you know, the world of COVID, you know, drove some of those things because people couldn't go to site, so they had to find ways of being really efficient on site and do things off site. We're in a situation where there is going to be a declining workforce available to us and yet a growing demand. So the only answer to that is to become more productive, and the industry's got to find a way, and what we're trying to do is to highlight some of the routes for that, and by demonstrating collaboration between ourselves as a group, hopefully set an example for others to try and follow and to build on.
Any final thoughts?
I'll give you a shorter answer to that. I think I would suggest that where we have things like frameworks, where we have that visibility of pipeline and the opportunity to duplicate and repeat, you know, we've seen it happening in education, we saw it on the prison framework previously. I think let's start with some of those where we've got the opportunity of the long pipeline, as opposed to perhaps some of the other areas where it's a project by project basis. You know, let's start with some of those first, and that's when we can really look at DFMA, offsite, those kind of things.
Any other final thoughts on that?
I just agree also about the duplication of design. We often get structures that are just not designed how we want to build them. So we go back to the beginning and say, no, we want to use post-tension slabs, we want to use precast columns, we want to jump the cores, but it's already been designed and the client's paid for it once. That's a huge waste. So getting this early engagement has got to hopefully drive to a position of better value for the client, and hopefully that will justify the decisions.
Very wise words, Brian, so thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for engaging in that session. I think that was hugely valuable in terms of the insights. Just to sort of conclude, obviously a huge amount of effort, not only by these people who have been put in behind the scenes, engaging with government, engaging with clients, working across the sector to address productivity and providing that guidance. So there's always more that stakeholders can do in terms of government, in terms of ourselves, and in terms of our businesses, etc. I think it's clear from the audience that we're all putting a lot of effort in to change the industry, to drive productivity improvements, and some of those insights have come out today. And hopefully you'll take those back to your organisations and maybe borrow with pride some of the things that have been mentioned today in terms of what Skanska have spoken about in terms of their framework and their leadership going forward, and in terms of what the lessons learnt that are coming out from the other speakers as well. So just in terms of where we're at now, in terms of the next step, it's lunch for around about an hour, and networking. So please make the most of the stands and the exhibitions outside. So you're all invited back at 1:45, where there'll be further opportunities to engage with the Construction News and the local government on collaboration and further talks this afternoon. So I'd just like to thank everyone in the room for their feedback and contribution today. But also, I'd like you to put your hands together for the presenters of this session and the speakers. Thank you very much.